He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him feel nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was so worried about. He worked in the local radio, which always used to tell his friends a lot more interesting than they probably thought it was. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but Thursday morning, the sun was bright and clear, and it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what would be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the counselor wanted to knock down his house and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up, blearily got up, wandered blearily round his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found some slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub, shaving mirror pointed at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bedroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to inspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint of the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought. He zombed off to the bedroom. He stood in thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it in gross length. He rather suspected his clearest visual recollection was glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one ever seemed to know about the ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out. He decided no one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover. He heard himself, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow. He himself thought. The word yellow wandered through his head in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house, lying down in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. I. Prosser, was it? As they say, only human. In other words, he was a quite carbon-based bipedal life form dependent to vape. More specifically, he was 40, fat, shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though, he didn't know was gone, though intervening generations and racial mixing had juggled his genes so there was no discernible Mongolian characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. El Braza of his mighty ancestry were pronounced stoutness about the tongue, and a predilection for little fur hats. As he was by no means a great warrior, in fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today, he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win. You know you can't win. Lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze furiously, but just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling around the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built. It's going to be built." "First, I've heard it," said Arthur. "Why's it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him and then stopped to put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses. Bypasses are devices that allow some people to dash from a point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A. So many people from point B are so keen to get there. And what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there? They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be." Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular. It was just any convenient point, a very long way from point A, and from point A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage point at D, with axes over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why, he just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable with each. Obviously somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, "You are quite entitled to make any suggestions or protest at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate times?" hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday, and I asked him if he'd come in to clean the windows, and he said no. He'd come to demolish my house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh no, first he wiped a couple windows and charged me a $5. Then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well, as soon as I heard, I went straight over to see them yesterday afternoon." "You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call an attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything?" "But the plans were on display." "On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a flashlight. Well, the lights had been probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you?" "Yes." a sign on the floor saying, "Beware of the leopard." A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow on Arthur Dent as he lay propped up in his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it." "You'll like the bypass." "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away. Take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, while his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel nervous. He stuttered for a moment, and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello, yes," said Arthur. "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage a bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "None at all," said Mr. Prosser, as he stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not a descendant of an ape, but in fact a small green planet somewhere in the vicinity of the Berkeley's, and not from Guildford, as he had actually claimed. This friend of his had arrived on the planet Earth some 15 years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though, because he had skimmed a bit of his preparatory search. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Perfect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking, but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was weary and gingerish, and brushed backwards on the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backward from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough. When you talk to him for any length of time, your eyes begin to involuntarily water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as an eccentric, but a harmless one, an unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gate-crash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicists he would find until he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. He would then start guiltily for a moment, relax and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, and a laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge to the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his school on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some girl and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of the flying saucers didn't matter much really. Thereafter, staggering Zarplactic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew a way to the Berkeley's. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford would invariably reply on those occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he had said green was that green was the traditional space livery of the Berkeley's trading scouts. Ford Perfect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive soon, because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-boggling dull as Earth. Ford wished that he had a flying saucer would arrive soon, because he knew how to flag the flying saucer down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 artillery a day. In fact, Ford Perfect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime, life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with occasional new ploy, such as the For the Public Good dog, or the March Progress dog, or the They Knocked My House Down Once, the Never Looked Back dog, and various other cajolerates and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved in a diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out. The mud in which Arthur lay in, a shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," and the shadow. Arthur looked up, squinting into the sun, startled to see Ford Perfect standing above him. "Ford, hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock my house down if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Berkeley, so For Perfection often failed to notice unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds Ford seemed to ignore him. Then he stared fixatedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk and drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now let's go to the pub." as immortalized as the ancient Orion mining song. Oh, don't give me none more of that old Shakespeare. No, don't give me none more of that old Shakespeare. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Shakespeare? Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to dip it and pour it into the glass of their opponent, who would have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jang Spirit is to depress the telepsychic power. As soon as predetermined quantity was consumed, the final losses would perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Perfect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to drink. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the horse and groom after all. But what about my house? He asked plaintively. Ford looked across at Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. He wants to knock your house down. Yes, he wants to build. And he can't because you're lying in front of this bulldozer. Yes, and I'm sure we can come to an arrangement, said Ford. Excuse me, he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with the spokesman for the bulldozer drivers on whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they could get paid if he did. Looking around, he was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had completely— Yes, hello, he called. Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet? Can we talk for a moment? Called Ford. Assume that he hasn't gone to his senses. Well, sighed Mr. Prosser. And can we also assume, said Ford, that he's going to be staying here all day? So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing? Could be. Well, if you resign to do that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you? What? You don't, said Ford patiently. Actually, you need him here. Mr. Prosser thought about this. Well, no, not so much, he said. Not exactly need. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, so you would just like to take a read if he's actually here, and I could slip off and down to the pub for half an hour? How does that sound? Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. That sounds perfectly reasonable, he said, reassuring tone and voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on, said Ford, we can always cover for you in return. Thank you very much, said Mr. Prosser, with no longer knew how to play this at all. Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind. He frowned, then smiled, then tried both at once and failed, grasped a hold of his fur hat and rolled it furtively around the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. So, continued Ford Perfect, if you would just like to come over here and lie down. What? Said Mr. Prosser. I'm sorry, said Ford. Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them from driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there? What? Said Mr. Prosser again. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, says that it will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over from him. What are you talking about? Said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, Mr. Prosser, spelling out a new thought to himself, to come lie there? Yes. In front of the bulldozer? Yes. Instead of Mr. Dent? Yes. In the mud? Yes. In the mud. As soon as Mr. Prosser realized he was substantially the loser, after all, if a weight was lifted itself off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew. He sighed, in return for which, you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub. That's it, said Ford. That's it, exactly. Mr. Prosser his steps forward and stopped. "Promise," he said. "Promise," said Ford as he turned to Archer. "Come on," he said to him. "Get up and let the man lie down." Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly and awkwardly sat down in the mud. He felt as if his whole life was some kind of dream, and that he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and his arms oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. "And no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away and all that, right?" he said. "The mere thought," growled Mr. Prowler. "Hadn't even begun to speculate," he continued, settling himself back, "about the merest possibility of crossing my mind." He saw the Postals driver's union representative approaching and let the head sink into the lower eyes. He was trying to get Marshall his arguments for providing that he did not now contribute to the mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened while he felt miserable or was put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself, in a high dimension of which we know things. The mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. The bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, incomprehensible strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him. In his head, what a day! What a day! Ford Perfect knew that it didn't matter. A pair of dingoes' kidneys, whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Myself, I trust him to end this earth," said Ford. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "And how far is that?" "About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink." That is chapter 1 of the book. If you guys enjoyed that, I might do more like that, maybe with a different book. I'll work on the setup a little bit, so I'm not reading in the dark. Maybe some children's books or something. Just do like some story times. I think that could be fun. You know what, I might try that out even if this doesn't